At 4:12 a.m., I arrived at Chicago O'Hare International Airport for Flight 287 to Seattle. It was supposed to be a routine business trip, the kind I'd taken dozens of times before. The terminal was unusually quiet, with only a handful of sleepy travelers waiting in line. As I approached the check-in counter, the flight attendant smiled politely and handed me my boarding pass. I thanked her, glanced down at it, and immediately stopped walking. The departure date printed across the top wasn't today's date. It was yesterday. I looked back up to tell her there had been a mistake, but the woman who had handed me the ticket had disappeared. In her place stood another employee who insisted no one else had been working the counter. Confused, I checked my phone. The calendar clearly showed October 18th, but the boarding pass read October 17th. Even stranger, the flight number, gate, and departure time all matched perfectly. Assuming it was just a printing error, I walked towards security. As I joined the line, my phone buzzed with a notification from an unknown sender. There was no number attached, only a message that read, "Don't board yesterday's flight." Before I could reply, the message deleted itself. When I showed it to the TSA officer, he frowned and quietly asked me where I had gotten that boarding pass. I explained what had happened. His face turned pale. Without another word, he waved me through security without checking my ID. The airport felt wrong after that. Every digital departure board flickered for a split second whenever I walked past. Most displayed today's flights, but every few minutes my flight briefly changed. Instead of Flight 287, the screen flashed Flight 287A with yesterday's date beside it before returning to normal. Nobody else seemed to notice. I stopped a janitor and asked if he had seen the screens glitching. He stared at me strangely before saying, "You shouldn't still be here." Then he pushed his cleaning cart away without another word. My heart started pounding as I hurried toward gate B14. The waiting area was almost empty. Only 6 passengers sat near the gate, all dressed in dark clothing. None of them spoke. None of them looked at their phones. They simply stared out the windows at the aircraft parked outside. The strange thing was the plane itself. Its paint looked faded, almost decades old, despite displaying the modern airline logo. The cockpit windows reflected the rising sun, even though the sun hadn't risen yet. I looked at my boarding pass again. The seat assignment read 18F. When I checked the seating chart displayed near the gate, there was no row 18. The numbering skipped directly from 17 to 19. A flight attendant approached me with a warm smile. She looked exactly like the woman who had handed me the boarding pass earlier. Before I could ask where she had gone, she quietly leaned close and whispered, "If they call your seat number, don't answer." Then she smiled normally again and walked away as if nothing had happened. Moments later, the gate agent announced boarding. Passengers lined up silently. No one spoke to each other. As the scanner beeped for each boarding pass, every passenger turned to look directly at me. Then the agent called loudly, "Seat 18F, you're next." I forced myself to stay calm as I joined the boarding line. Every passenger ahead of me walked in complete silence, never once speaking to the gate agent. Their boarding passes were never scanned. The agent simply looked at each ticket, smiled politely, and waved them through. When my turn finally came, she took my boarding pass and frowned. For a brief second, her face lost all color. She quickly glanced around to make sure nobody was watching before whispering, "This ticket should have been destroyed yesterday." Before I could ask what she meant, she stamped the pass with a loud click and handed it back. The stamp wasn't today's date. It read, October 17th, boarding complete. The jet bridge felt unusually cold. Halfway to the aircraft, every light suddenly flickered off. For 3 long seconds, I stood in complete darkness. Then emergency lights came on, bathing the hallway in a deep red glow. I heard slow footsteps somewhere behind me. Thinking another passenger had caught up, I stepped aside. Nobody walked past. Instead, a voice whispered from directly behind my shoulder. "Don't sit by the window." I turned instantly. The hallway was empty. When the normal lights returned, the whispering stopped as if it had never happened. Inside the aircraft, the cabin looked decades older than it had from outside. The seats were worn, the overhead bins were scratched, and the air smelled faintly of smoke and burned metal. I found Seat 18F exactly where my boarding pass said it would be. But according to the airport seating chart, row 18 didn't exist. Across the aisle, an elderly woman slowly looked up from her lap. She stared at me with frightened eyes and quietly asked, "Is this your first time on Flight 287? I nodded. She closed her eyes, sighed deeply, and whispered, "Mine too, every single time." As passengers settled into their seats, I noticed something impossible. Nobody had carry-on bags. Nobody placed anything in the overhead compartments. They simply sat perfectly still with their hands folded. Even stranger, none of them blinked. A flight attendant walked down the aisle performing the usual safety demonstration, but instead of explaining emergency exits, she calmly said, "In the unlikely event of an accident, please remain in your assigned timeline." Several passengers nodded, as though they had heard the announcement many times before. My stomach tightened. I pressed the call button, but instead of a chime, the speaker above my seat crackled with static. Then a familiar voice whispered, "You're already too late." The cabin lights dimmed as the aircraft slowly pushed back from the gate. I looked out the window, expecting to see the terminal disappear behind us. Instead, the airport looked abandoned. Every gate was empty. The departure boards were dark, and dozens of parked airplanes sat covered in dust, as though they hadn't moved in years. Then, without warning, every passenger on the plane turned their heads toward me at the exact same moment. None of them smiled. None of them blinked. They simply stared until the captain's voice echoed through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Flight 287. Our destination today is Seattle, as scheduled yesterday." A cold shiver ran down my spine. I grabbed my phone to record what was happening, but it showed no service, despite being on the ground only moments before. Suddenly, a notification appeared from an unknown sender. There was no phone number, only a single image. It was a news article dated October 17th. The headline read, "Flight 287 crashes minutes after takeoff, no survivors." My hands started shaking as I opened the article. The accompanying photograph showed the very same aircraft I was sitting in, engulfed in flames in the middle of a forest. Below the photo was a passenger list. My eyes scanned down the names until they stopped on one line. Nathan Carter, Seat 18F. Deceased. My heart pounded as I jumped out of my seat and rushed toward the front of the cabin. "This plane crashed yesterday," I shouted. "We have to stop." Not a single passenger reacted. The flight attendants continued smiling as though they couldn't hear me. I reached the cockpit door and pulled on the handle, but it wouldn't move. Then the intercom clicked on. The captain spoke calmly. "Please return to your seat, Mr. Carter. This flight has already landed once." At that exact moment, the aircraft hit violent turbulence. The overhead bins burst open, but instead of luggage falling out, hundreds of old boarding passes floated through the cabin like snow. Every one of them was dated October 17th. One of the boarding passes landed in my lap. My breath caught as I looked closer. It wasn't mine. It belonged to a woman sitting 3 rows ahead of me. Stamped across the front in dark red letters were the words, "Deceased, identity confirmed." Then I noticed something even more horrifying. Every passenger around me slowly reached into their pockets and unfolded identical boarding passes. One by one, they turned them toward me. Every ticket carried the same red stamp. Every passenger had died on yesterday's flight. Then the elderly woman across the aisle looked into my eyes, smiled sadly, and whispered, "The only question left is whether you died yesterday too." Panic took over. I backed away from the passengers, clutching the boarding pass with trembling hands. Every person on the aircraft remained perfectly still, their lifeless eyes fixed on me. Then, without warning, the cabin lights went out. Only the glowing "fasten seatbelt" sign illuminated the darkness. A few seconds later, the captain's voice returned over the intercom, but it no longer sounded human. It was distorted, slow, and filled with static. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are now approaching the moment of impact. Please remain seated, exactly as you did yesterday." The aircraft suddenly shook so violently that oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling. I ran toward the emergency exit, ignoring the terrified whispers behind me. The handle wouldn't move. Every exit door was locked. I pounded on the cockpit door, screaming for someone to let me in. Slowly, it clicked open by itself. The cockpit was completely empty. There were no pilots, no co-pilot, no one controlling the aircraft. Yet the controls were moving on their own, as if invisible hands were flying the plane. On the captain's seat rested a black flight log. I opened it with shaking hands. The final entry read, "October 17th, all 143 souls accounted for. One passenger still refuses to remember." Beneath the sentence was my signature, written in my own handwriting. Suddenly, every screen inside the cockpit switched on at once. Instead of flight instruments, they displayed security footage from yesterday. I watched the aircraft lose altitude before crashing into a forest in a massive explosion. The video then showed rescue crews searching the wreckage. One firefighter pulled a burned boarding pass from the debris. The camera zoomed in, seat 18F, Nathan Carter. Then another video began playing. It showed me standing outside the burning wreck, completely unharmed, staring silently at the flames while rescue workers ran straight through me as though I wasn't there. I finally understood the horrifying truth. I hadn't survived the crash. I had never left it. The plane suddenly became silent. The passengers slowly stood from their seats and turned toward me. None of them looked frightened anymore. They simply watched with sad smiles. The elderly woman stepped into the aisle and gently placed her hand on my shoulder. "This flight repeats because you keep trying to go home," she whispered. "But home no longer exists for you." Tears filled my eyes as I looked out the window. The clouds disappeared, revealing a burning forest thousands of feet below. Wreckage was scattered across the trees, exactly as it had appeared in the news article. Then the flight attendant who had first handed me the boarding pass smiled sadly and asked, "Are you ready to accept yesterday?" The next thing I remember was waking up on a bench inside O'Hare Airport. Airport security surrounded me, asking if I was okay. They said they had found me asleep near gate B14 before the airport even opened. My boarding pass was gone. Flight 287 had been cancelled because of a mechanical problem, and according to the airline, seat 18F didn't exist on that aircraft. For a moment, I convinced myself it had all been a nightmare. Then I walked past a television in the terminal. Breaking news flashed across the screen. Investigators continue searching for the victims of yesterday's Flight 287 crash. The report showed all 143 passengers. As the camera panned across their photographs, my face appeared among them. Beneath it were the chilling words, "Nathan Carter, missing." My phone vibrated one last time. It was a boarding notification from the airline. There was no flight number, no departure gate, only a single message. "Thank you for flying with us. Your next departure is yesterday."